Why has the Labour government dragged its heels so clearly? And it seems to me that there are only two reasons for that. One is, of course, they don't want to lose the Muslim vote. Mm-hmm. They would rather continue to sacrifice young, white and Hindu and Sikh girls on the altar of multiculturalism in order to secure Labour seats. We know that people like Jess Phillips, for example, who's the safeguarding minister for women and who, of course, will condemn any man who makes some sort of cheeky comment on the street to a woman but refuses to call out the rampant misogyny, the sexual violence within certain Muslim communities, particularly the segregated communities, silent on all of that.
Eric's written an article in Unheard, but he's also shared a lot of the data and statistics on Twitter, X now. And his tweet has had 18 million views.
Hello and welcome to Newspeak, the New Cultural Forum's look at the weekly news. I'm Amy Gallagher and I'm joined today by Philip Kiszely, a Senior Fellow of the New Cultural Forum and Cultural Historian, and Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, Royal Historian and Senior Fellow of the New Cultural Forum. We're going to be looking at the Grooming Gangs investigation. We've got a bit of an update, or well, not so much of an update on that. But before we do, Philip, you've got some locals events to talk through.
Yes, there's lots going on as per usual with locals. You'll be able to see some of the events scrolling underneath me as I speak. We have, of course, the conference, the London conference, which is happening on Saturday, the 1st of November, which promises to be absolutely superb. And I think tickets are going extremely fast on that, aren't they, Rafe? So I think there are just one or two tickets left. So please do get in there and buy your ticket if you'd like to go there. We're also looking at developing some new groups as well. And an old one, we're resurrecting an old one, Wolverhampton. If you're in and around Wolverhampton and you'd like to be involved with locals, do get in touch. Tom Bowen from the King Alfred School I'm delighted to say, is taking over that group. And he's got lots of enthusiasm and lots of energy and lots of expertise as well, actually. So that should be really, really good. And of course, we're developing a group in Belfast too. So if you're in or around Belfast, again, please do get in touch. Locals at newcultureforum.org.uk. These events are free unless they're a ticketed event. And we'd just love you to be involved.
Thanks, Philip. Rafe, so it was 4 months ago now that Keir Starmer and the Labour government announced that there would be an investigation into the grooming gangs. Initially, there wasn't going to be one. Then it was the pressure, wasn't it, of Elon Musk and it being pushed online and across social media and in the news that eventually they caved and said there was going to be an investigation. However, it seems to be stalling. Is that right? Or taking longer than we would have hoped?
Yes, it's a disgraceful situation we're in now, where we are, as you say, 4 months into the call for a national inquiry, even more months since the Labour government actually decided it wanted to have a series of 5 local inquiries. Yeah. And neither on the local level nor on the national level has there been any development. We're in a state of stasis. And in fact, it's so bad that we don't even know what the remit of this inquiry will be. They haven't even laid out the framework. And then, of course, they can't even find a single person to chair the inquiry. The people you would normally go to, the former judges, senior lawyers, KCs and so forth, they all seem reluctant to get involved with this, probably because they find it too distasteful a subject, too distressing a subject, or indeed they're just not brave enough to tackle the question of Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs and the perpetrators of all of that. And that, of course, is going to cause a huge amount of distress to the victims, the countless victims, possibly tens of thousands of people who've been waiting for this. Again, almost, having to relive the pain and the tragedy of all of this situation. And you have to ask, why is this? Why has the Labour government dragged its heels so clearly? And it seems to me that there are only two reasons for that. One is, of course, they don't want to lose the Muslim vote. They would rather continue to to sacrifice young, white and Hindu and Sikh girls on the altar of multiculturalism in order to secure Labour seats. We know that people like Jess Phillips, for example, who's the safeguarding minister for women and who, of course, will condemn any man who makes some sort of cheeky comment on the street to a woman, but refuses to call out the rampant misogyny, the sexual violence within certain Muslim communities, particularly the segregated communities, silent on all of that. We know that so many senior Labour cabinet ministers, their seats depend upon a few hundred votes, and so they're scared of losing the Muslim vote over all that. I mean, that's bad enough, but I think also, and I don't think enough attention has been given to this fact, is how complicit senior politicians on the local level were with what was going on. How many Labour head councils, how many Labour mayors, heads of councils, and even local MPs were fully aware of what was going on, try to cover it up in order to essentially guarantee the Muslim vote coming forward. We've had on our channel Raja Mia, the whistleblower, and the things that he reported were outrageous. You know, he spoke about Muslim leaders, Muslim gangs going door to door, knocking on the doors of Muslim families. Some of them couldn't even speak the language, telling them to give them a postal vote, just to sign the postal vote, and then vast tranches of these unfilled, incomplete postal votes were then given over to the Labour Party, ensuring that they would win elections. Now, that is the sort of stuff we used to expect in the rotten boroughs of the 19th century. This is happening in 21st century Britain, the sort of thing you'd expect. This is the politics of Pakistan being imported to this country, the politics of, of the third world coming here, rampant corruption, gerrymandering, call it what you will. I mean, the fact that more attention hasn't been given to this, I think, is amazing. Why the Tories aren't banging the drum? It's primarily the Labour Party that's been involved in all of this. Also, of course, the government so quick to try to go after British soldiers in Northern Ireland for things that they may have done in Northern Ireland. Yeah. Well, what about all the police? What about the social services? What about the local councillors and the local councils who were either covering up or in some cases, as we know, were complicit in some of these rapes? As we've had stories about Yorkshire Police, for example, certain individuals potentially being involved in some of these rape gangs themselves. I think all of this is one of the reasons that the Labour Party is trying to cover it up. And I think the more that they drag their heels, the surer it is that they're going to go down to an even bigger hammering at the next election. They're already tied with the Green Party at 15% in the polls. I think it just takes the Reform Party to take up this banner and actually drive another nail into the Labour Party.
It doesn't surprise me that this is stalling. I mean, I had mixed minds about whether there should be an investigation or not. And this was kind of the reason why I wasn't sure that there should be, because it felt to me like just too big of a task, that we just don't have the calibre of people to properly kind of get to grips with this, and that it would just be a whitewash. I mean, we know from Dame Casey's report that it's primarily, Pakistani men, which means whoever did this report would have to answer as to why it was. And to me, all roads lead to kind of Islam, really. You'd have to factor that in. I don't see how you couldn't. But the political atmosphere is such that just does not want to be looked at, does it?
No, and in terms of research, it's actually, that makes it very easy. Yeah. In terms of aims and scope, it's actually very easy. And they're saying, oh, well, we don't know what how we're going to frame it and all of it. It's the easiest thing in the world, but it's that, quote, toxic element of the Pakistani rape gangs that they don't want anything to do with. Gary Neville was a couple of weeks ago, wasn't he? He was blaming white middle class men for being too angry. I keep saying across social media and in publications that we are not angry enough for all of the reasons that Rafe has just said. But the situation is just so incredibly dire. I've just been looking at some of the reports from Rotherham, some of the local reports and the reviews from Rochdale and Oldham, and the way these children were treated. The social workers were calling children who were 10 prostitutes, So they were blaming children for their own abuse and completely exonerating adults who were plying these children with cigarettes and alcohol for sex, basically. Well, for certain kinds of sex, which I won't say here because it's just absolutely revolting. And if you think about the constituencies that we're talking about here, just take two, for example, take Rochdale and Oldham. Okay. Rochdale is, I think, 18.8% Muslim, most of which is Pakistani and Bangladeshi. Rochdale, Oldham is 25%. So these are like countries within countries. They have their own rules, their own set of rules. They have negotiated policing. It's very difficult to penetrate. And like you, I feel very pessimistic about a report that tries to deal with that. And it's not just those places. Huddersfield, a fairly big town, is 35% Muslim. So these places are lost to a different culture, a culture that is hostile, a conquering religion. That's what we really need to be worried about. But again, it comes back to this idea that the caseworkers, the social workers, all of these people, they will not engage with the fact that these men are Pakistani and Pakistani heritage. They will just not engage with it. And until that happens, this will carry on time and time again. And if they can't present a review with the very, very simple parameters, then God help us.
When they were discussing the terms, as you say, which they can't agree on, apparently it was one of the considerations was whether or not to include other forms of child exploitation other than grooming gangs. So there's already a kind of
but we've already had that, haven't we?
Yeah, there's already an attempt to broaden it out, to muddy the waters, and to not make it. Everybody knows what this is about, but they just don't want to face it. And I'm thinking as well I know that on the panel of this investigation are some survivors, and you just think they are being re-traumatized again by having to wait all this time, and to be given this kind of hope, which is then going to be taken away from them. And nobody ever, you never hear anything about the victims in the press, hardly ever. Where are their stories? Like every now and again, but you don't hear their voices coming through in the way that you would expect to, do you?
We already had the Alexis J inquiry report, which was a multi-year report, but that again covered every aspect of child exploitation, which is useless at the end of the day because there's never going to be the laser-like focus on any one of those issues. She's already complained just yesterday, I think, or the day before, that of her 20 recommendations, which came out years ago, only 2 have been implemented. 2 out of 20 recommendations. She places the blame at both the feet of the Labour Party and the Tory Party. And you're quite right. This cannot expand into a broader look. This inquiry is specifically about the role of Pakistani men in all of this and the degree to which they're overrepresented in this. That's the purpose. That's the remit. We don't really have time or energy to deal with bigger issues than that. But we know quite clearly what the game plan on the Labour Party is because these inquiries do take multiple years. And if they had hit the ground running, we should be 4 months into the gathering of evidence. You don't even need to start the inquiry. You can start the gathering of evidence and so forth over the past 4 years. The local inquiry should have been doing this anyway. And what they're doing, I think, is kicking it into the long grass because an inquiry now wouldn't finish until after the next general election where Labour will be out of a government. So that seems to be quite clearly what they're doing is they're just trying to delay things until they're no longer in government.
And of course, the really appalling thing is that the victims, as you say, are nowhere in this. Yeah. They're constantly called stakeholders in the inquiry.
Yeah, it's weird.
But they're anything but. This should be a victim-centred inquiry and they should be actively involved and front and centre in terms of how this is framed, how this is carried out, and they should be aware of how all of this data is being gathered. They're not. It's happening above them and it's political and it's about, as Rafe quite rightly says, it's about survival. This is just about survival for the Labour Party and about survival of this poisonous ideology in which we cannot at all, we simply cannot criticise Islam and specifically Pakistani men who are carrying out mass rape of our children.
I mean, this is one of the most kind of demoralising stories of our time, I think, and it just drags on, and you just, as soon as you think, it can't get any worse, then something happens and you just feel disappointed for the victims all over again. But gladly, we've got some good news for the rest of the show, so don't get too demoralised. Eric Kaufman, I don't know if he was heading this study, but he's brought this study to light, hasn't he, on Twitter, and he's been writing about it. There's a study on US universities, isn't it, about whether they identify as trans or non-binary, and he's showing that it's gone quite significantly down over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, he's obviously heading the impact aspect of the research, which means he's sharing this academic research with the general public. And I was quite surprised at this, not so much at the results themselves, as I was telling you before, but the wider impact. So, Eric's written an article in Unheard, but he's also shared a lot of the data and statistics on Twitter, X now. And his tweet has had 18 million views. And I was really surprised at that because I didn't think the trans debate had that kind of currency anymore. I thought we'd kind of had it and then the absolute adherents would stick to it and we'd just have to fight the institutions, fight the media, and it would just be a kind of ongoing depressing standoff. But it really feels as though there's some real currency here. And what he's saying basically is that it's just dying. And he's looking at undergraduates, he's looking at senior year undergraduates, but he's also looking at freshers, and he's looking at how all of they are just not identifying as trans anymore. And that tells us absolutely what we already knew, that this was a social contagion, that this was fashion, this was rebellion. And interestingly enough, you see how it frames itself as rebellion. So, I'm not talking about America, I'm talking about here, because there's a very clear link to the guy who got arrested, the Oxford guy who was chanting about Zios and all the rest of it. He was transed up, he was in makeup, right. he had nail varnish on. He was obviously on that kind of spectrum. And it's just one of those things, isn't it? It goes with Islamism. It goes with hard left politicking, trans, the environment, all of those things. So it's just a catch-all thing. So I'm really, really pleased that one, this study is getting so much oxygen, via Eric, who's a very good friend of this channel. And two, the results look as though they really are for young people, which is the crucial thing, going in the right direction.
So the results are, there were 60,000 people surveyed of US universities, and it shows that 3.6% currently identify as trans or non-binary, but in 2022 it was 6.8%, so it's almost halved. So that's the good news. The bad news, though, is that political beliefs haven't changed. So beliefs in woke or progressivism, leftism, that stayed the same. So it's quite interesting. It's almost like it's expressed itself through trans, and now maybe it's expressing itself in a different way.
We've seen that for years, haven't we? So it started with Me Too, then it went on to BLM, then it was masks and lockdown, then it was trans, then it was the environment, now it's Hamas, for God's sake. So this is, again, it's trends, and it moves on and on and on. I think there's one thing that we do have to worry about here, and it's terms of how the questions are framed, how people are responding to the word gender. We're not really quite sure about. So the news might not be quite as good as we think it is, but it's still good news.
Yeah. What do you make of this, Rafe?
Well, I think some fascinating stuff has come out of this report. For example, that the halving of people at university who identify as trans also mirrors the halving in people who aren't trans, who have or claim to have mental health troubles, claim to have depression. So that's going to make people in the trans lobby very uncomfortable. Because what it's saying is, people who aren't trans have had a 50% reduction in mental health and depression at the same time that people who are identifying as trans have had a 50% reduction. Now, is there a connection between that? Is there others? We know, for example, people who have autism are 11 times more likely, I think it is, to identify as trans as well. There's another interesting aspect to this, and that is the fact that people in elite universities and Ivy League schools are more likely to identify as trans. Now, this goes back, Professor Jonathan Haidt at Harvard University years ago was speaking about how elite Ivy League universities are more likely to be woke than non-elite ones. And his theory was it's because children there become residential. They go into these elite universities, they're cut off from their family, they're staying in, and so it's almost like Lord of the Flies. They're completely immersed and surrounded in that culture, whereas people who go home every day and sleep in their parents' home don't suffer from the same levels of woke. And I think this is the same sort of phenomenon we have here. People are going into universities where they're surrounded by this ideology and they get taken in by the whole thing. And of course, it's the new cohorts then, 2 years ago, were more likely to be trans than the older cohorts. trans, and now the new cohort's coming in. So again, it is this rebellious, it is part of this rebelling, although, as you quite clearly say, the mentality is the same.
Yes.
But it struck me as very funny because, in this population of 70 million people in this country, there are only 200,000 people who identified as trans in the last survey. And then those figures were inflated because people who didn't speak English very well didn't understand the census. So actually, I think
doesn't that just sum up the country?
Yeah, that really does.
But it's 0.05% of the population identifies as trans. So we still have 3% of people at university levels. So there's still a great degree of delusion happening. And I found it amazing that suddenly you had this huge spike, and it seemed to be quite clear this was a popular culture, fashionist idea. And it's just a question of wondering how long it will be before the university levels of people who identify as trans mirrors more closely the national average, which is less than 1%.
Yeah, another statistic to come out of this was that, gay and people identifying as gay and lesbian has been kind of stable, hasn't really gone up and down. People identifying as queer has really sharply declined. And it was this weird term that nobody really knew what it meant. It could mean gay, but it could mean you're just a bit rebellious. And it had a political vibe to it, didn't it? It was kind of, gender. It was Judith Butler and queering.
Yeah, it's a verb as much as anything.
Yeah, to queer something.
It's
but
to queer
that's
something.
going out of fashion as well. So, yeah, that is good news.
It is good news, and these things are all fashions. They're fashions and fads. It's just appalling that we have to be on the receiving end of them. So this idea of queer politics comes with a particular set of clothes and hairstyles and regalia and symbols and all of that kind of thing. Young people really buy into this for a time, but it can't last forever because young people want the new thing. They want to move on to something different. The problem is the different thing is just going to be a different iteration. It's not going to be radically different, at least not yet anyway.
Well, I was thinking, it was kind of pro-Palestine, wasn't it, that kind of took over. But now there's been a ceasefire. I'm sort of thinking, what's next? What's going to be the next big thing? But anyway, more good news that we've had. So people remember the case of Hamid Koskan, who was the man who was charged with a public order offence for burning a Koran. He was actually stabbed after he burnt the Koran, and that was kind of used against him as evidence that he caused public disorder. So it was quite a shocking case, really, because it was sort of blaming the victim. He's been backed by the Free Speech Union, and his case has been overturned actually in the Court of Appeal, which is really positive news. It was a shocking case, wasn't it? And I thought, my gosh, where are we headed with this? But it is good that it's been overturned.
This is such an important ruling we have here, where common sense is finally followed through. Basically, what happened was, of course, we had this person who burnt the Quran was convicted of the offence, and the person who tried to stab him didn't receive jail time. Still had a criminal conviction, but didn't get jail time for that. And that sent out a message to all of the zealots and the extremists to say, basically, you can do what you want without any fear of repercussion against this. And what the judges now have quite rightly said, and I want to quote here, quite clear, Mr. Justice Bennett, and we owe him a great deal of thanks. There is no offence of blasphemy in our law. Burning a Quran may be an act that many Muslims find desperately upsetting and offensive. The criminal law, however, is not a mechanism that seeks to avoid people being upset. The right to freedom of expression is a right worth having, and it must include the right to express views that offend, shock, or disturb. Now, that's so important. I think we need a round of applause for that. It's so rare to hear that from a member of our judiciary. But that doesn't just also mean that other people can now burn the Quran, I would hope, freely. It also sends a message to the police and others to say, look, if you can burn a Quran now, and that's not deemed to be offensive, well, I'm sorry, retweeting a limerick certainly falls far below something so incendiary as burning a holy book. And so hopefully the police will then get a wake-up call and say, yes, you do not have the right not to be offended. I have the right to cause offence, and as long as it's not a direct incitement to violence, I'm sorry, you have no business policing these issues. So hopefully this is the beginning of a change of attitude.
Yeah, I was thinking, I do wonder if this is going to have ramifications in pushing back against future future Islamophobia laws. I don't know if it's that strong that it can turn the tide on that, but it does feel very positive. I did think, oh gosh, because with Islamophobia has been just pushed and pushed and pushed, and you always feel like that's the big thing that nobody wants to stand up against. But I mean, that is great to hear, isn't it?
It is, and I was just, as you were just saying that, I was thinking exactly the same thing. It's great that this particular instance, this test case for free speech, has actually been won, and common sense has prevailed. But it's the broader context for me that is really important. And if we're looking, bearing in mind the conversation we've just had about the grooming gangs and about demographics and about sheer power and the wielding of power of the Muslim demographic in this country, in particular key areas. And this happened in Manchester as well, didn't it? Mm-hmm. So I was talking about Manchester before. All of that stuff comes into the equation. The fact that this pushes very much against this narrative surrounding the Islamophobia law at this particular time, I think we should be really grateful that this has just happened now, because again, it's one of those things. These are, it's like putting together a brick wall, isn't it? A defense. And this is a really important brick in that wall of the defense against this almost a kind of tidal wave of, I came up with a phrase that last weekend or the weekend before, and it was Islam fatigue. I feel as though I've got Islam fatigue because everything is about Islam. We live in Britain, but everything is about the Middle East. Everything is about Islam. Everything is about Palestine. We need a defense against this stuff to say, no, it isn't. Just push it away. We can say what we want. And if this is one step down the road towards having that robust defense against Islam, then we don't have to think about it all the time. Then my real problem is that I have to think about this all the time because it infects every single issue in this country. And this is a Christian country.
And what was terrifying about this case was that it sort of gave the okay for political violence in a way, because the fact that he was stabbed was used against him. So the idea is that if you want someone to shut up, if a future person was going to burn the Koran or say anything about the Koran, if you're violent towards them, they are more likely to be charged. It was like, oh my gosh, we're really down the looking glass here. But thankfully, it has been overturned. And what was
I think people need to understand precisely what you're saying here. This man who burned the Quran, someone tried to stab him. And he was charged with causing a public disturbance because this man wanted to stab him.
Yeah.
Now, that's equivalent to a woman walking in a miniskirt through some area.
It's exactly the same thing.
If people try to rape her, well, it's her fault for dressing like that because that's just the level of insanity. The Crown Prosecution Service also charged this man for causing offence to the religion of Islam. As if, but in law, every person in Israeli law knows only a person can be, a religion is not an individual under the law. And yet, these people were acting like they were first-year law students, and this is the Crown Prosecution Service.
Yeah. But it's just endemic across the board, and that's the attitude, isn't it? We saw it with Charlie Kirk, who was brutally murdered, and people were saying, well, he was a fascist. What do you expect? And all of that kind of thing. We see it again in the conversation we've just had with 10-year-olds being described as prostitutes, being promiscuous, rather than the adults taking the blame for horrendous abuse. It's the world is upside down, and the world is, our world in this country is completely divided, and at the center of that upside down divided world is Islam. That's what we need to deal with.
Yeah, it's a very good point, actually. In the wake of Charlie Kirk, this feels even more important, actually, considering that he was stabbed. But anyway, that's all for Newspeak this week. Thank you, Rafe. Thank you, Philip. If you're a member, you can join us for our extra content for members, where we're going to be looking at a recent survey, one of the biggest surveys the BBC's ever conducted. And, people don't like the BBC that very much, not surprisingly. See you next week.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.